Hi, and welcome to SSON's AP Automation Digital Summit. Naomi Sequel here with the SSON, and I'm excited about this next session, sponsored by OpenEnvoy. And this is all about the race towards digital transformation in finance. And we're going to hear firsthand from one of OpenEnvoy's customers, Scoular, about how they're accelerating their AP journey and some best practices learned along the way. So do put your questions in the Q&A tab located at the bottom of your console. Also visit the Resource Center. They put a tremendous amount of great content in there for you, including an analyst report on $1.3 trillion being trapped in working capital and how winning AP teams can drive remote productivity. And also feel free to connect with our speakers. I've placed their information right on the console for you. So let's get to it. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Joining us, we have Matthew Tillman, who has spent the past 20 years building machine learning software in finance, advertising, and logistics for the world's largest brands. Matthew's the co-founder and CEO of OpenEnvoy, which is a fast-growing AP automation company, which recently completed a $6.5 million seed round led by Reat Ventures. And OpenEnvoy audits every invoice before you pay, automating costly finance workflows that prevent billions of dollars in wasted spending. And we have Leslie Lanz, who is controller at Scoular. And she oversees F&A for 2 large businesses, and over the past 4 years, Leslie has successfully helped Scoular create a strong internal control environment, and that's resulted in more streamlined processes and solved transactional issues. So welcome both. Thanks for being here. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sounds great. Thank you, Naomi. We really appreciate it. I really appreciate having Leslie here with us as well today. Just a quick bit of overview of what we're going to discuss. This will be a little bit different than a lot of case study webinars that at least I participated in. We're going to go a lot more into context about the company, the buyer, the problem set, et cetera. And so Leslie's kindly agreed to help us do that. So again, thank you very much for joining us today, Leslie. I just wanted to get a real quick background on you specifically so that people understand sort of how you came into this, how you came into Scoular, and then we'll talk a little bit about Scoular as well. But why don't you give us a little rundown on you and your department or team?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. So my name is Leslie Lanz. I'm a divisional controller here at Scoular. 125-year-old company with locations in North America, South America, and Asia. I was hired as an assistant controller about 4 years ago to oversee our freight forwarding business, and since then branched into commodity trading, which also is heavily involved with ocean carrier and supply chain transportation. I have a team of 7 employees, and the bulk of them process payables and are heavily involved with working with our ocean carriers day in and day out.
And I think we heard on another call that we did what seems like a decade ago, that you guys were the 7th largest shipper in America or something like that, importer, exporter, that is. That it includes cross-border, of course, as well. But I thought that was really impressive just in terms of the size and scale.
Yeah, we do quite a bit of carrier business. Our annual carrier spend is anywhere between 85 to 110 million a year, and we ship to over 80 countries. I think this year our projected carrier spend is going to be close to 100 million.
Yeah, it's really, really impressive just in terms of the size. And why don't, we're talking already about sort of transportation AP, which is, really problematic and really difficult in the industry today. It's not something that every company faces, but those companies that face that particular problem find it to be really challenging. And just a couple of stats on that, right? You typically find that only 27% of all invoices globally are audited, so matched for accuracy. And then 30% have at least one error. I think in the shipping line space, it's actually north of 35%. And the majority of those errors favor their supplier. So I've got to ask you, what's so hard about freight in particular, ocean transportation as well? Is it the amendments? What is it that makes it such a difficult service to really match and control for?
Number one, it's definitely capacity, manpower. I have 4 merchandiser assistants, bookkeepers, whose jobs day in, day out is just processing payables. And just based on volume, there's just not enough time to go back to the contracts or amendments and physically check each individual rate. And then carriers, they're just well known to not be clean. They're messy. I'd say for us, we're closer to 45 to 50% of invoices have errors. We'll receive duplicate invoices. It's just not a clean process on the ocean carrier side.
Yeah, we were talking to an ocean carrier recently about this particular problem, and it turns out there's just so many subcontractors involved. So we see that in almost all variable cost invoice challenges in AP, or when there's variability in the contract or in the rates themselves, the surcharges, accessorial charges, it causes real challenges. And in the commodity space, as you're in, you've got really high volumes. You've got to pay very quickly, right, in order to release or receive the cargo. So it's really challenging in terms of a time commitment. I'm glad you said that. So when you think about your experience leading, even before OpenEnvoy, you were working in this group. What obviously there's a really high cost in terms of overhead, in terms of operational inefficiency. Is that the thing that led you to find other solutions, or did you have something in place historically and it just wasn't working? Can you tell us about your experience, I guess, coming to the point of when we started working together?
Yeah, of course. So our merchandiser assistants, going back 4+ years ago, they would just receive the invoices statements physically tied out just to our ERP and then paid invoice. There was no auditing done. We looked into another third-party solution that was supposed to automate our payables, do like a three-way matching, regardless of the type of invoice. That did not live up to expectations. We also tried to build it out in-house. We found if, a vendor, specifically like truckers, if they just, moved one box over, it would cause a whole bunch of issues. And from the longest time, we were just, trying to figure out how to create better efficiencies with processing payables, to get away from, just having a person or 3 people checking one number to here. Doing that day in, day out is not fun, does not promote employee engagement. And we came across OpenEnvoy, which is specifically geared to ocean freight, which is a big problem area.
And you mentioned lots of different types of invoices. So your team is responsible for ocean freight, but generally the forwarding business, which means a lot of different types of invoices. Can you give us some examples of what that would be outside of ocean?
We have my team, they handle ocean freight, freight forwarders, truckers, agents, insurance, kind of a wide variety, but all relating back to transportation.
And you mentioned that, that headcount cost of, not having great employee engagement, right? When people are running around trying to find contracts and all sorts of PDFs to match things, et cetera. And then you also have to compound the problem. It's not just a type of invoice, it's many types of invoices and, potentially turnover in the team, et cetera. Was there, this is very common, by the way, for all of our customers to have something that causes them the greatest amount of pain and then realize it's actually connected to everything because there's a retraining process in place. If you had to look at this sort of, we classify sort of the biggest challenges in the space as these 3 things on the left of manual processes, complex workflow, recovery processes are really big as well. Can you, I'd be curious to hear, and we're going to ask the audience this as well. So at the same time, I would love to hear what you think were your biggest challenges of these 3. Which one was really causing you sort of the most pain and difficulty?
Well, from an employee standpoint, definitely the manual processes. I think we can all agree, we all get bored if we're doing the same thing day in, day out. Love to get away from that. But from a company standpoint, definitely the recovery of payment. If we are falling behind with ocean carriers, they'll threaten us with credit hold, and then we're having to pay pretty much everything up front, and then having to go back and fight for overpayment or duplicate payment. And that's also time consuming and takes employee resources. So definitely twofold there.
And when we think, so this is a question for the audience. I'd love everyone to pick just a single aspect on this. Instead, we intentionally didn't make this all of the above. But when you think about your own AP process, irrespective of what types of invoices they are, which of these categorizes the biggest challenge you're facing? Is that visibility, workflow, so automation, et cetera? Dispute resolution is still workflow, but it has a direct impact on cash flow. And while the audience answers this question, I'm just going to have ask Leslie to double click a little bit on the aspect of credit hold. So many companies in the media space, you get 30, 90, up to 90-day payment terms. When it comes to shipping goods and manufacturing goods in a global supply chain, you guys are one of the biggest shippers on the planet, 130-ish years old. You've been around, you've been doing this successfully for a very long time. Is it because of the procurement cycle that you end up in a situation with the lines? Because lines do not offer, credit effectively for the most part to commodity shippers especially. Is that something you've been able to push back on a little bit because of how many times you're getting duplicate billed and overcharged and things like that?
I mean, yeah, we definitely push back on it. We have a carrier relations team that is our intermediary between our ocean carriers and accounting sales. And we, push back as much as we can, but in certain cases, the carriers can just pull credit and say, hey, and otherwise, we're not releasing BLs, you can't get your containers, and then that costs more money, not just paying up front, but then there's detention to demurrage, and it'll snowball and have a pretty significant impact on the P&L.
Yeah, an impact on P&L. And the other thing we were learning was an impact on, cash flow, obviously, an impact on credit, the cost of capital, et cetera. So it can really dovetail. But with that, we're going to go into a little bit about some of the activities that we've done together. So the team, so on the call, the majority of the people focusing on dispute resolution, which is very problematic, and most vendors don't focus on dispute resolution as much as maybe we do. So we'll dive into that a little bit as well. So thank you everyone for answering. So Scoular's objectives with the automation. We've talked about automating manual tasks a little bit, freight audit before you pay as much as is possible, right, depending on how quickly you have to pay that particular carrier. And then the visibility, which allows you to perform better dispute resolution. Were there any other objectives that you had in this process, or maybe things that have come up that you didn't necessarily expect to come up in the process, or has it been pretty straightforward?
I mean, it's been fairly straightforward. I know, the one area we definitely have built out as a team between Scoular and OpenEnvoy is the dispute functionality. It's definitely tough to track outstanding disputes with carriers and stay on top of them. So it's been nice to have everything in one place. And then we built out the reporting and the dashboards within OpenEnvoy to provide us with metrics and show everything in one space, which prior to this we did not have.
Yeah, let me skip ahead to that. So that's really interesting. We had a fascinating call, I think, with the transportation team on which carriers are over or under billing, vendors generally for those on the call who are over and under billing. And I think they were pretty surprised by this as well. So you said visibility actually in the dispute process has actually been really important. Have you, can you give us an example just in terms of the size of disputes? Because I think we had a big one last year come up, right, in terms of disputes.
I mean, we dispute multiple invoices a month, and they all range in dollar amounts. I mean, we'll dispute anywhere from $1,000, $1,200 to upwards of 30,000, 40,000. And it just depends on what the carriers are coming back and invoicing us for, and if we agree or disagree with the charges.
And do you feel, in terms of sort of the working relationship, you alluded to it earlier, which is OpenEnvoy, we take a very different approach in terms of partnership than most startups do and most tech companies generally do, whereas we don't charge professional services and we don't have change management fees and things of that nature. And so first of all, who are you working with on our team most often?
Primarily, it's been Deb Rupert.
And so you've really partnered with the CS team there for primarily. And so how does that, because you've got a distributed team, right? You've got people in Minnesota, you've got people in Nebraska as well, I believe. And how does that, how do you coordinate that from a customer perspective in order to ensure these sorts of outcomes?
I mean, with partnering with OpenEnvoy?
That's right, yeah.
Yes, I mean, we have weekly calls with Deb to go over system updates, questions we have. And over the past month, we've been heavily talking back and forth about our dispute functionality and what we're seeing in OpenEnvoy. And every idea we've had, Deb's taken straight back to the development team, and then 2 days later comes back like, yep, they're working on it. We should have it in QA in a week. I mean, Deb has been very instrumental with taking our ideas and building them out and making them reality.
That's great for me to hear, and I'd love to get into results a little bit. So, you know, this is on the onset. Did you have a number in mind that you were trying to hit in terms of increase in efficiency or dollars saved, or did you have that in mind, or were you really just trying to like get a baseline because you had so much volume it was kind of impossible to handle internally?
Yeah, definitely just establish a baseline just with the systems we have. It was tough to just get any sort of KPIs developed that we could measure, you know, carrier accuracy, spend, cash flow, any sort of carrier metrics just did not exist prior to OpenEnvoy.
And when we look at the results, so there's a couple of results here that are pretty substantial, right? Especially with regards to an ROI. So a 31% increase in automation of manual tasks within a pretty short period of time. What were sort of the biggest items that led to that for you? The biggest pieces of functionality, I suppose.
Well, I'd say, you know, just improved employee engagement, gets them away from the same mundane manual tasks. So they can focus on, you know, discrepant invoices and following up with traders on disputes to, you know, get an updated status and hopefully get those resolved sooner than we have in the past.
Yeah, you mentioned traders and you mentioned just collaboratively internally how you guys work. So what is the traditional way of doing this, where the trader goes out, they book the deal, they book the cargo, they book the freight as well, and then you have to go to the trading team to resolve any sort of discrepancies, I guess, in a manual world, correct? And now we're taking in the data that they would have otherwise given you manually, and then we're able to match those automatically within the system, correct? That's roughly the overview that you received, right? And so that matching process is effectively eliminated. So now you're focused on disputes. Have you noticed more disputes than you were expecting to see, or was it about what you expected to see based on your history?
It's about what I expected. I mean, disputes have been a key issue for us since I started, and it's an industry norm, especially with carriers, that there's always disputes. The one nice thing with OpenEnvoy too is we're able to identify those variances sooner, and it's easier to resolve those disputes if, like, we bring them to the carrier's attention right away versus, you know, we get the invoice and right as like 2 months after it's due, bringing it to their attention, then it's tougher to resolve. So that's been a bonus as well.
Yeah, and actually, you notify the carriers almost immediately of the discrepancy, right? And in that situation, when you notify the carriers of a discrepancy and generate a dispute, how does the carrier respond? Like, what is their response? Is the response to release cargo? Is their response sharp as well, or do you still have to tug on the carrier a little bit?
It depends on the carrier. Some are more timely than others. But usually if we're bringing it to their attention right away, I mean, there could be cases too where they just correct it. We don't even need to file like a formal dispute. But that's like if we bring it to their attention right away, and preferably before the invoice is even due.
How long do you have to pay an invoice in traditional, let's say for the Transpac trade or someone that's more common, more relevant for you?
I mean, it depends on the carrier. I think anywhere between, say, 14 to 30 days. We also work with freight forwarders. Some of those we don't even have credit terms with. They would like payment right away. So it just varies vendor to vendor.
Yeah. And keeping track of that is pretty tricky. Do you keep track of, how do you keep track of that, the payment terms today? How were you keeping track of that?
Well, all of our payment terms are established in our transportation management system. So then when our payables are generated, they'll have their associated due dates based on those terms. And then that's how our merchandiser assistants track what should be paid versus not based on the due dates in our AP aging.
Yeah, and I think for others on the call, it might be helpful just to say, I think, from a transportation management system perspective, you guys are using Oracle OTM, right? I think there's a lot of companies that are using OTM as well. And then you have a traditional back office environment as well, right? So traditional IAS sort of back office environment. Were you using other types of software in the past? I know there's, OCR got kicked around a little bit in there in the beginning. I'm not sure if it was still there. And sort of what were your experiences so far with that type of technology?
Like I brought up earlier, it's something we ventured into, and then we found that like if someone changed up their invoice slightly, like we try to build it out for carriers plus our truckers. And truckers, I mean, we work with a lot of like mom pa's where they're just taking their phone and sending us a picture of a handwritten invoice. Systems didn't like those types of invoices, or if it's something that like someone generated their computer and they moved the due date like just one line down. The system wouldn't like that either. So that was kind of our struggle with OCR. And then we did look into another third-party solution that was promised that they could handle every single type of invoice. And then also we continued to run into issues. And then it was like, well, are you using Microsoft Chrome or Internet Explorer? Because that's an issue. Like, well, no one uses Internet Explorer anymore, so we're in Chrome. And it was definitely one of those solutions where they, overpromised, underdelivered, and that relationship did not last too long.
Yeah, we've had a lot of what I call them OCR refugees come to the company as well, and freight out refugees. And one of the things that happens is we're able to process 100% of your invoices, which is a little bit different. A lot of times companies are saying, well, let's get up to mid 90s if we can, and then just do tolerances for the small to fix items. When we look at this number in terms of $500,000 in duplicate invoices within 6 months, that's a pretty big number that sort of your point solutions don't typically capture. Can you tell us a little bit about how? I mean, it obviously was received very well at the firm, but was this alone kind of a surprise to you? Was this like, how did you feel, and how did your team feel after you saw this particular number?
I mean, I'm personally surprised that it was this high. The one nice thing is that all those invoices prior to this, like we were still looking at these invoices, like right away they come in, like we don't know they're duplicates, so then we're still looking at this invoice, comparing it to our ERP, and oh, actually this was already paid, we don't have to worry about it. And now we're not having to do that as much. But the dollar amount is quite surprising to me.
Yeah, it's interesting. You guys mentioned how much you spend roughly on transportation costs. We've seen numbers as high as something like 1.7 million in discrepancies for every 7 million in spend. So pretty large numbers. But I think even in terms of duplicates, where a lot of this comes from, just for the folks on the phone, is in any environment, media, transportation, manufacturing, where there's a lot of subcontractors that are fulfilling on behalf of the contracted party to the customer. You end up with a lot of discrepant billing because they don't have the systems required to connect and communicate automatically and dynamically with the vendor that you are actually the customer of. And a lot of times the duplicates pop up, and duplicates are pretty extreme in the shipping space because they use a variety of tactics to reduce their own internal costs at the carrier. And when they reduce their internal costs at the carrier, they place that cost of discovery on their customer, which has historically been the way that it is. So you start to see things like a single PDF, as an example, will have 15, 20 invoices on it, or you'll have a single document that is effectively a statement, and then that statement has maybe hundreds of invoices on it. And so it's not just that the format's different, but that the source material is actually different and the baselines are different. So we spent a lot of time matching on duplicates, not just on the vendor name and the total, which is what most companies do, but we use a variety of keys to match duplicates. And I'll tell you, Leslie, this is a great number for you guys, and it's an unfortunately very common number for our customers before they come to OpenEnvoy. You've mentioned so many sort of key bullet points for me in this conversation that you had employees were suffering under the weight of manual processes, right? So that's like number one. Number two is they'd effectively become, in certain other technology implementations, they become, trainers. They become the man in the loop, effectively, is what we call it in machine learning. They become the trainers of the models with quite a bit of concerted manual effort. Can you describe, now that we know the environment sort of before OpenEnvoy in terms of what the team was doing, and you said it's freed up the finance team, are there some specifics that they're now able to focus on? Is it payment? Is it, more strategic aspects? Like what is your team working on now that they're not, paying attention to the many thousands of disputes that exist on an annual basis?
I mean, yeah, focusing on disputes, following up with traders on discrepant invoices, because it's going to our traders who book the sales. I mean, they know what we should be getting invoiced, so it's staying on top of them, working through other issues, and then Scoular in general, we're working on many other projects. Like another one is AR automation, so it'd be nice for our merchandiser assistants to, focus on other projects within the company that could impact other areas outside of AP. And then, just coming to work and being excited versus, having to just, I guess my day is just sitting and comparing invoices to the system and paying it. That doesn't sound exciting. So, hopefully they become more engaged.
Yeah, that is perhaps the best bullet point that I've heard, is that you can come to work and actually be excited about your job and hopefully work a normal number of hours versus the 10 to 20 that are required when you're doing freight manually. Right?
For sure. And then, it's never fun if you're working on one thing and then a fire comes up over here because a carrier or a trucker is mad and wants payment now, or there's a threat of a credit hold. So avoiding those situations.
Yeah, especially given how the commodity trade works and how competitive it is and how razor thin the margins can be. If you have a credit hold, and that's a pretty substantial hit to the business. So I think it's wonderful how we've been able to help your team remove credit holds. Obviously, that's those two. You want to come to work and you're removing credit holds. That's I think the biggest wins that I can hear as a founder of a company. So I appreciate that. I think one thing that I'd like to say just overall before we start to get into Q&A, and we've got we'll have 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A here. It's one of those things that companies don't like to face, but it is mathematically impossible to build a scalable business without automation. So everyone sort of knows they need to automate and make a lot of really aggressive decisions on automation. I think one big thing that you guys have done that's been better than most companies that I've seen in the space is you've really partnered with us. You've really, the weekly calls are great, of course, but the fact that you're very clear in what you're looking for makes our jobs very easy in an effort to give those to you, which is probably why we release software so frequently for you. But we want to make sure that you have everything you need and that it is automated, that we're integrating with the right processes. But realizing that it's not possible to build by just hiring, more and more headcount, and then making more and more headcount suffer, and then turning over more and more headcount. That's not a path towards profitable, scalable business, and especially in lower or thinner margin businesses where you really have to hit high volume numbers. And so that's something that we see all the time is companies need to really commit to this idea and take leadership and ownership. So I think in terms of key takeaways, I love these slides, but my key takeaway from this is, you had a really severe challenge in terms of volume. Headcount growth, extreme headcount growth wasn't the path towards success on that volume. And you needed to partner with someone who's going to focus on automating so that you would actually enjoy showing up to your job, which is probably my favorite aspect of this, number one. And then number two, of course, helping the company. Now as a finance team, you've put in place a structure that helps them, avoid credit checks is one way to think about it. But the other way to think about it is just improve the cost of capital and improve the treasury aspects of the business just from this world of AP automation, which I think is absolutely fantastic. Is there anything else that you'd like to say in terms of a key takeaway before we get into Q&A here?
I mean, for us, with our relationship with OpenEnvoy, we've brought you many issues. We've even, tried to throw some curveballs at the system. OpenEnvoy has done a great job of understanding our issues. We've walked them through our process, like step by step. They make sure that they fully understand everything that we deal with and what they can do to help. And then from my team, I feel like our relationship with the business has improved because we're now, bringing variances to their attention as soon as we identify them. And previously, we were late to the game doing that because we just didn't have the capacity to do so.
Great. And it looks like we're a couple minutes over, actually. I got the timer on my side. So I want to thank everyone. Happy to handle questions externally. You can always get a hold of one of us. But thank you very much for your time today. Leslie, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it was great to chat with you again. It's been a bit.
Thank you both. It was a really good presentation, some really impressive stats that you shared, and good luck to the team now that they're able to free up and focus on some other tasks. I can't wait till the next time we meet and we can hear about all the cool work that they're leading.